I'm now stood outside the gatehouse of what was Richmond Palace. Richmond Palace was an impressive royal residence. It was built by the grandfather of Elizabeth I, Henry VII, Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor, of course, being the first of the Tudor legacy, the first of Tudor royalty, he had taken the throne from Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Another story, but I'm sure many of you will be familiar. After that, this entire location would become Richmond because who became King Henry VII had been the Earl of Richmond. This area was previously known as Sheen, which is why you still see Sheen used in road names and used to describe the location. But it's known today as Richmond thanks to Henry VII. It's also where monarchs would come to die, like Elizabeth I, because it was a place of comfort. Now, not long later down the line, which we'll speak about in the near future, Charles I was beheaded, and shortly after Charles I being beheaded, Parliament truly was in control. This building, the palace, was then demolished. Parliament decided that it was no longer needed and they sold it. So we're very lucky to still have the gatehouse, this impressive gatehouse, which is so relevant to the Tudor family itself. So we have to take into account that Elizabeth was both human and cunning in her youth. There are stories which tell us of her being quite modest and charming in her own way, and there's other stories which we can get the idea of her being a bit cunning. She, taking the side of her father so strongly when he had basically murdered, we can call it executed, but murdered her mother, a strange one even for royalty. And it leads me and others to believe that she was either completely besotted by her father or had an early understanding of the throne from young and was in fact in love with the idea of the monarchy itself. Now, when her father Henry remarried, trouble was afoot. Eventually, her younger stepbrother was born, Prince Edward. This threw them into further turmoil. Now, the two were officially considered bastards, both Mary and Elizabeth. And a bastard is not something you want to be if you was just a princess. So Elizabeth was now entering the most dangerous part of her life, whether she knew it or not. Her world was about to disappear. Almost her God, King Henry VIII, passed away, further pushing her down the ladder of importance. Elizabeth is now placed in the care of her stepmother, Catherine Parr. Now, multiple males would have been seeking Elizabeth's hand in marriage as a power play. During Henry VIII's lifetime, it would have been very difficult to get in and manipulate your way in. But when he died, there was a huge void that was left. And so a man named Thomas Seymour started lurking. He wanted Mary or Elizabeth as his wife, but the Privy Council wouldn't agree to this. So he instead targeted the ex-wife of King Henry VIII and stepmother to Elizabeth, Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr accepts the marriage, and so begins the sexual assault of Elizabeth I from what would have been her stepfather. Catherine takes on the parentage, takes on the care of Elizabeth, and Elizabeth moves in with Catherine and Thomas. And Thomas slowly starts to try and push his weight and sexualize the young Elizabeth, walking in on her when she's asleep, when she's getting dressed. And there's tales of Elizabeth struggling with this because as a young girl, she almost enjoyed the attention of a man who was so wealthy, who was charming, who was considered to be quite important. But on the other hand, she felt her honor was being incredibly slighted. And there's tales of her getting up early, dressing early so that he wouldn't catch her. But it's also true that he left a mark on the young girl, which she was almost quite flattered by, which would come up later. When Catherine eventually found out about this, her stepmother, Elizabeth was sent away. Not long after Elizabeth being sent away, Catherine died due to a failed pregnancy. Now, in actuality, Catherine Parr was perfectly right to be jealous and to not trust both her stepdaughter and her new husband. Thomas Seymour was a dog. He didn't care for his new wife. He was merely waiting for her to die. After all, she was just a power play to him. Immediately after her death, he needed a new power play, and he asked Elizabeth to marry him. Knowing she was somewhat fond of him and she'd been flattered by him, he hoped this would work. Now, Elizabeth, much to the shock of many people, said to him she would do it. And bear in mind, this is the queen that never married. So we're learning where she got some of her traits in her early days. She said she'd do it if the Privy Council agreed. But Thomas had no interest in waiting for the permission from the Privy Council. So he hatched a plan. And this is where we see his demise and a further change in the life of Elizabeth I. He was charged with conspiring to basically kidnap, use his close position to the new young king, King Edward, to kidnap the king and to gain power over him. It's said on the night that he attempted to break into the king's room, one of the king's dogs alerted the guards, and the rest is all downhill from there. He was taken to the Tower, and Elizabeth, who had served some of her life already as a princess, was now being interrogated as part of a plot to kidnap the King of England. From a young age, Elizabeth understood that any man approaching her would be making a play for power. This must have been very difficult for her, who lived her entire life without love. She came close a few times, but was always torn at the last minute. Now, towards the end of her life, it was starting to build up. The depression really took hold. We have many accounts which speak of her depression and the reasons for it. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, is said to have plagued her. Some warrants that she was supposed to sign for executions could take her days to weeks to months just to sign because of the guilt that she felt inside. We see from Elizabeth a human, not a robotic ruler with no morals. Yes, she was certainly able to commit cruelty, but that's just something that all monarchs have been taught to do from young. So like the conversation on the line of succession, Elizabeth was not ready for death either. As she became more ill, or seriously ill, in March of 1603, she found herself in a place of comfort at Richmond Palace. But her mentality clearly showed that she was not ready. It said that she was terrified of bed. She was terrified of her own thoughts. She knew that this was the end, and her fear of replacement was becoming a true reality. She saw people that she'd lived beside for years, members of the Privy Council, noblemen. She saw people dying, and this to her, just like us today, would have been like watching your own life pass. And it said that on the lead up, she wouldn't go to bed for love nor money. In fact, one account says to us that before she went to bed for the very last time, it's like she knew, she could tell inside. And she stayed in one of her royal rooms for 2 weeks on the floor wearing the same clothes. And as her advisors asked her to go to bed, she refused, because in her mind she knew that when she went to bed, that was it. After 2 weeks of being on the floor, she was picked up and stood for many hours more, swaying in pure denial. So on the 23rd of March 1603, the Tudors' worst nightmare came true. Their final royal died. Queen Elizabeth I died here at Richmond Palace, the home of her grandfather, Henry VII, her father, Henry VIII, and a home to her during her lifetime. This place isn't only special because it's one of the few places we have in relation to her grandfather and her father and herself, but it's special because it's somewhere that the Tudors found to be truly safe, safe enough to end their days.